Welcome to the deep dive. Today, I want you to just imagine looking up into the sky over your neighborhood and seeing a swarm of mosquitoes. Not just a few stragglers by the porch light, but a coordinated release of millions of them. 64 million to be exact.
Yeah, that honestly sounds like the plot of a disaster movie, especially since, mosquitoes are responsible for more human deaths than any other animal on the planet.
Right. Usually a swarm means you're swatting, grabbing the bug spray, and just retreating indoors. It sounds like an absolute public health nightmare.
Oh, for sure.
But consider this. What if that release of 64 million mosquitoes wasn't an invasion at all? What if it was a highly calculated intervention? And what if the group asking the government for permission to release them wasn't your local vector control agency, but Google, or I guess more specifically Alphabet, Google's parent company?
Exactly. And that is why we are looking at a massive paradigm shift here. This is the moment where the sheer scale and automation of Silicon Valley tech suddenly collides with, well, the incredibly fragile balance of local ecology.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a stack of sources today, ranging from tech journalism in The Guardian and the Next Web to the actual Environmental Protection Agency regulatory filings, plus some public policy debates on the Effective Altruism Forum, and a really in-depth analysis from animal welfare advocate Ed Box.
We definitely have a lot of ground to cover.
We do. So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out why a company famous for its search engine wants to become a titan of biological pest control, what their debug project actually entails, and what this means for the ecosystem hovering right in your backyard.
Because Alphabet has formally submitted an application to the EPA for an experimental use permit, they are asking to release up to 32 million mosquitoes a year, over 2 years, across areas in California and Florida.
Hence your 64 million bug total.
Right. And the public comment period for this proposal closes on June 5th.
So let's get straight to the how here.
Okay.
Because they aren't outfitting these mosquitoes with, like, tiny microchips or microscopic lasers, they're using a biological Trojan horse. It's a naturally occurring bacterium called Wolbachia.
Wolbachia is doing the heavy lifting for this entire project. It's an incredibly common bacterium in nature. You actually find it in about 60% of all insect species.
Wait, really? That many?
Yeah, butterflies have it, fruit flies have it. But critically, the specific species of mosquitoes that transmit some of our most devastating diseases, like the Aedes aegypti or the Culex quinquefasciatus, they do not carry it naturally.
So the debug project takes lab-reared male mosquitoes and infects them with this Wolbachia bacteria. Then they release these infected males into the wild. The males fly out, find the wild females who don't have the bacteria, and they mate.
And here is where the cellular biology gets so fascinating. When that infected male mates with an uninfected female, it triggers this phenomenon called cytoplasmic incompatibility.
I kept seeing that term in the papers. Can you break down what that actually means on a cellular level? Like, why doesn't it work?
Yeah. Think of it as a catastrophic mismatch in their reproductive software. The Wolbachia in the male essentially modifies the sperm. So when that modified sperm fertilizes the wild female's egg, the paternal and maternal chromosomes just cannot synchronize properly during those very first cell divisions.
So the cells just fail to divide.
Exactly. The chromosomes fail to condense, the cell division halts, and the embryo essentially shreds itself. The eggs are laid, but they never, ever hatch.
Wow. You're turning the mosquito's own biological drive into a dead end.
Generation by generation, the wild population crashes simply because the offspring never develop.
Wait, hold on. Let me just channel you, the listener, for a second.
Yeah.
If you're telling me you are dropping 64 million mosquitoes over my house in Florida, my very first thought is I'm never going outside again. Aren't we just creating a massive, itchy, biting nightmare for the residents?
It is the single most common visceral reaction, for sure, and it's completely understandable, but the biology offers a very specific protection here. Male mosquitoes do not bite humans.
Because they physically can't, right? They don't have the parts for it.
Correct. They simply lack the mouth parts to pierce human skin, and they don't even have any biological need for blood. Male mosquitoes survive entirely on flower nectar.
Oh, that's right. It is only the female mosquitoes that bite, because they require the dense protein found in our blood to develop their eggs.
Exactly. So by exclusively releasing males, Google isn't adding a single extra bite to the environment. They are strictly releasing a biological delivery mechanism.
And the target of this mechanism is highly specific. This EPA application is going after the Culex quinquefasciatus mosquito. This is a primary vector for West Nile virus and St. Louis encephalitis.
Right, particularly across the southern United States.
Yeah, the CDC data from our sources shows West Nile is the leading cause of arboviral disease in the U.S., and the trend lines are unfortunately going up. In 2025, there were over 2,000 reported human cases.
And while a lot of people are asymptomatic, for the fraction of a percent who develop neuroinvasive disease like meningitis or encephalitis, it's absolutely brutal. No vaccine, no specific treatment.
We even saw a recent positive sample confirmed locally in Riverside County, California, which makes it feel very immediate.
That immediacy is exactly why vector control, stopping the mosquitoes themselves, is our primary lever for public health.
But the Wabachi technique itself isn't a new Silicon Valley invention. The sources note scientists have been using this sterilization method for about 15 years now. So, why does a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate need to get involved?
Well, because proving a biological concept in a pristine university lab is completely different from deploying it across 2 U.S. states. The biology of the infection is straightforward. The logistics of the deployment are a complete nightmare.
And here's where it gets really interesting. If the entire strategy relies on releasing only males to crash the population, your sorting process has to be utterly flawless. I mean, it's like trying to separate a million grains of salt from a million grains of sugar while they're all flying around the room.
It's arguably worse than that. If your technicians make a mistake and accidentally release thousands of Wolbachia-infected female mosquitoes into a neighborhood, you haven't just increased the biting nuisance for the residents.
You've triggered a massive scientific risk.
Yes, because those infected females can breed. They use a specific strain of the bacteria called WLB.
Right, and if fertile females carrying that strain get out, they will meet with wild males or the released males.
Exactly. They will pass the bacteria onto their offspring, and suddenly, the Wolbachia becomes permanently established in the wild population.
And if the wild females have the bacteria and the released males have the bacteria, the cytoplasmic incompatibility stops working. The software mismatch is basically fixed.
Right. The eggs hatch, and you've just rendered your own biological weapon completely useless.
So the margin for error is effectively zero.
It has to be. Human technicians using microscopes and tweezers simply cannot sort tens of millions of mosquitoes with zero errors. That is why Verily, which is Alphabet's life sciences subsidiary, that incubated the debug project before Google acquired it, stepped into the arena.
They looked at a biological puzzle and saw a massive data and automation problem.
Precisely.
They built a microscopic factory assembly line powered by AI. I was reading about how this works, and the computer vision aspect is wild. How does a camera even tell a male mosquito from a female mosquito?
It relies on subtle physical differences at different stages of life. They actually sort the insects twice to ensure purity. First, when the mosquitoes are in the pupal stage.
So essentially their teenage transition phase.
Yeah, they're sorted by size. Male pupa are slightly smaller than female pupa. Automation system, which removes about 95% of the females right off the bat.
But 95% isn't a zero margin of error, not when you're dealing with 64 million bugs.
Which is exactly why they have a second, high-tech sorting phase for the adults. As adults, male mosquitoes have very distinct, bushy, feathery antennae.
Oh, they use those fluffy antennae to hear the specific wing beat frequency of the females, right?
They do. So Alphabet trained AI optical sensors using millions of images to instantly recognize those antennae. The mosquitoes are passed through a system where high-speed cameras scan them, and the AI algorithm blasts any remaining females out of the release batch.
It is wild. And it doesn't even stop at the sorting. They use vast data analytics and software algorithms to map the release zones. They figure out exactly where, when, and in what concentrations to drop these fragile insects to maximize the mating disruption.
Deploying them from custom-built vans and even drones? Yeah, it is a logistical symphony.
But does it actually work outside the lab?
The data suggests this high-tech approach is incredibly effective. Verily ran trials in Fresno County, California, starting back in 2017. In 2018 alone, they released over 14 million males.
And what were the results?
Staggering. The number of female biting mosquitoes dropped by over 95% in the release areas compared to the control areas. In one particularly isolated test neighborhood, they saw a 99% reduction.
Wow. And in Singapore, dealing with severe, persistent dengue fever outbreaks, the debug project achieved an 80 to 90% suppression of target mosquitoes. That actually translated to a real-world human impact, like a more than 70% drop in dengue fever cases.
Those are undeniably impressive metrics. But, 64 million lab-bred mosquitoes still sounds incredibly intimidating to a community. To judge the debug project fairly, we have to look at the baseline. What is our current method for fighting these vectors?
Wait, yeah, aren't we already spraying for these? Why this sudden need for high-tech bug?
Because our current approach is hitting a biological wall. The status quo is broadcast chemical fogging, trucks driving down residential streets spraying organophosphates and pyrethroids into the air.
I tend to think of chemical fogging like using a sledgehammer to fix a pocket watch. Sure, you'll stop the watch from ticking, but you destroy everything else in the process. Those chemicals are entirely indiscriminate.
They absolutely are. Organophosphates work by overloading an insect's nervous system, but they don't just target the disease-carrying Culex mosquito.
Right, that toxic fog takes out bees, butterflies, moths, vital pollinators.
Yeah.
It is massive collateral ecological damage.
Not to mention, the sledgehammer is getting less effective. Mosquitoes reproduce incredibly fast, which means their evolutionary cycle is fast. They were rapidly developing genetic resistance to these traditional insecticides.
So they literally evolved to produce enzymes that break down the chemicals before they can even damage their nervous system.
Exactly. So if chemicals are a failing destructive tool, the field of biological control has naturally exploded. But Google isn't the only company trying to build a better mosquito. You have another highly publicized player named Oxitec.
And it is vital to understand the difference between their approaches because they are fundamentally different mechanisms. Because when people hear lab-altered mosquito, they immediately think of genetic engineering. We should be clear. Google's mosquitoes are not genetically modified. They were just infected with a naturally occurring bacteria.
Right. It's the difference between giving a bug a cold and rewriting its source code. Oxitec is rewriting the source code.
How so?
Well, Oxitec uses the OX5034 strain, which is genuinely genetically engineered. They insert a synthetic lethal gene into the DNA of the males in their lab.
Okay, and then what happens?
When those genetically modified males mate with wild females, that lethal gene is passed on, and it acts as a kill switch that specifically causes the female offspring to die before they reach adulthood.
What's fascinating here is how the regulatory bodies treat these two methods. Because Alphabet's debug project uses that naturally occurring Wolbachia bacteria, the EPA actually considers it the less radical technology.
Right. The regulatory burden on Oxitec's genetic modification is significantly heavier. The EPA documents reveal intense precautions for the genetic approach.
Like what kind of precautions?
Well, Oxitec's lethal kill switch gene can actually be neutralized by tetracycline, which is a very common antibiotic.
Wait, meaning if the mosquito comes into contact with the antibiotic, the kill switch turns off, and the genetically modified female just survives and breeds.
Precisely. Because of that risk, the EPA forces Oxitec to map out a massive 500-meter buffer zone around any potential environmental sources of tetracycline in their release areas.
So that includes things like wastewater treatment plants, or commercial citrus crops that use antibiotics for blight, or cattle facilities.
Exactly. Oxitec is legally barred from releasing their GM mosquitoes anywhere near those zones.
And if Oxitec detects even a single surviving genetically modified female in the wild during their monitoring, they have to immediately halt all releases. They have to blanket the area with chemical adulticides and larvicides. The fail-safes are massive.
Contrast that with Google's Wolbachia approach, which is entirely self-limiting without the need for chemical buffer zones.
Because if Google halts the release of their infected males, those males eventually die off anyway.
Right. Without a constant influx of infected males, the suppression stops, the wild population slowly rebounds, and the ecosystem reverts. They aren't permanently re-engineering the local ecosystem with synthetic DNA.
Okay, so 95% reduction rates and self-limiting biology sound great on paper. Yet, when I look at the piece by Ed Box on his Substack Animal Politics and scroll through the EPA public comments, it is a wall of opposition. Why is everyone so incredibly angry if this works so well and is supposedly so safe?
Because the skepticism isn't just blind anti-science panic. There are deeply rooted ecological and ethical concerns when you scale this up to tens of millions of insects across massive geographical areas.
Let's look at the scientific pushback then. First, that fail-safe we discussed.
Right. The margin of error with the AI sorting. We are trusting a search engine company's proprietary AI algorithm with a fragile ecosystem.
Alphabet claims a 99.9% sorting accuracy, but when you're releasing 64 million mosquitoes, that 0.1% error rate means potentially releasing 64,000 fertile Wolbachia-infected females.
And if those females establish the WLB strain in the wild, the whole reversible, self-limiting argument entirely collapses.
Yeah, that's a huge issue. I also have to push back on the ecological vacuum argument I see a lot of critics making too. The idea that nature abhors a vacuum. If this tech works perfectly, and we wipe out the Culex mosquito in a specific city, what happens to the space they leave behind in the food web?
It is a valid ecological unknown. Mosquitoes, despite how much we hate them, serve a function. They are prey for birds, bats, and spiders.
And their larvae process organic detritus in stagnant water.
Exactly. Now, past isolated suppression studies generally find minimal disruption to the local food chain when a specific mosquito species is reduced.
But, generally minimal in past trials is very different from proven safe when scaled to tens of millions across Florida and California.
Oh.
Are we risking another, potentially worse disease vector rising up to fill that vacated ecological niche?
Which brings us to the ethical dilemma. Ed Box points out a fundamental issue of governance. The residents living in Fresno, California, or the Florida Keys never explicitly opted into being part of a massive biological experiment.
So what does this all mean for the concept of consent? A bureaucratic notice is tucked into a federal register, a 30-day comment period opens, and the government considers that public consent.
Yeah.
How many people actually living in those neighborhoods have any idea this is happening, let alone possess the technical background to parse an EPA filing?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are watching a profound tension develop between private corporate action and public trust. Critics like Box argue that a for-profit tech conglomerate shouldn't be running open environment biological releases.
Public trust in massive institutions is at an all-time low. Communities do not simply accept expert assurances of safe and effective without massive transparency anymore.
Especially when you look at who is doing the releasing. This isn't a university research lab or a county health department operating on a public grant.
It's Alphabet, a company whose primary business model revolves around data extraction, advertising, and proprietary technology. They are explicitly running these EPA trials to support a future commercial product registration.
This raises an important question about liability and oversight. If that 0.1% sorting error happens and the ecology is permanently altered, who is liable? Who owns the massive amounts of hyperlocal data being collected by the drones and ground sensors mapping these neighborhoods during the deployment?
Critics argue the burden of proof for intervening in an ecosystem should be incredibly high before deployment, not studied after the fact.
Absolutely.
The framework for how we allow private tech corporations to intervene in public biology is still being built, and it feels like we are building the airplane while we are flying it.
It really does.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We explored the incredible promise of the Debug Project, how it harnesses natural Wolbachia bacteria and microscopic AI sorting to potentially eradicate deadly diseases without having to blanket our communities in toxic organophosphates or alter insect DNA.
But we've also examined the very real anxieties surrounding that promise. The fear of unintended ecological consequences in the food web, the deep skepticism toward corporate-run environmental interventions, and the vital need for genuine, informed public consent when you propose altering a local ecosystem.
And remember, this is not a hypothetical sci-fi debate for the next decade. The EPA comment period for this 64 million mosquito permit closes on June 5th. Regulatory agencies are actively deciding the future of public health and local ecology right now.
It emphasizes a critical modern reality. As our technology scales up to meet massive global challenges, our systems for public oversight, transparency, and ecological precaution have to scale up right alongside them.
Which leaves me with one final thought for you to mull over. Let's say the EPA approves this. Let's say Google's debug project is wildly successful, and they manage to completely clear a city's ecosystem of disease-carrying mosquitoes using this continuous release method. What happens to our natural world if, 5 years from now, that tech company decides the project is no longer profitable? What if they lose funding or pivot to a different industry and the weekly releases just stop?
Well, the wild populations will inevitably bounce back.
Exactly. By relying on a proprietary, continuous intervention, are we essentially putting our safety from nature on a corporate subscription model?
That is a deeply unsettling but absolutely necessary question to ask as we step further into this new era of biotechnology.
So next time you imagine looking up into the sky and seeing a swarm of 64 million mosquitoes, remember, the scariest part might not be the bugs themselves, but the terms of service attached to them.